Today we're going to do a tunnel talk. It's going to be a little bit different, but I think it's going to be quite interesting. I sat in on this presentation back in December, part of the New England Vegetable and Fruit Conference, and I thought it was pretty cool. So we're going to take a look at those results again today. Now, before we get started, just a few upcoming events. We are still sort of in the full swing of our sort of event season, I would say, webinars, workshops, AGMs, all that good stuff. So this is just a few things that I kind of have on my radar. So for this series itself, we are going to do an integrated pest management on high tunnel pests, April 7th. That's going to be pretty cool. We're going to be looking at some of the ways that we can better our sort of IPM practices on farm and how we can incorporate things like banker plants to really help work for us. May 5th, we're going to do a bit of a tutorial for the Perennia online spray guides. I'm going to try to do this tutorial virtually, so it's going to be pretty interactive, kind of have everyone try to work through the guide and sort of answer some questions, just so we can get a bit more familiar with this as a tool and how that can help us on farm when it comes to selecting what sort of products we want to be using, when, how, and all that good stuff. We will have pesticide points available for both of those sessions, so yeah, keep your eye out. Some of my colleagues are going to be organizing an Ask Us Anything on grazing cover crops, March 19. So for anyone who is interested in that, I definitely recommend you participate there. And our berry specialist will be doing a berry primer on March 20th. That one's sort of a full marathon. I think it runs from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. at night, just talking about berry aspects of berry production. And it looks like we're going to be doing a bit of a beekeeping session coming April 1st. So it looks like the details on those are still being confirmed, but keep your eye out on perennia.ca. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to our guest speaker. Vern Grubinger is here from New England, and he's going to talk about some of the work he's been doing.
Sure. Thanks, Talia. All right. Well, I'll just let you know I've been with UVM Extension for 35 years now. So big part of my job has been nurturing the community for more interconnectedness and communication and feeling both the technical support and social support, I would say. And yes, I will share the links, although they're really easy to find. If you just Google vvbga.org, Vermont Vegetable and Berry Growers Association, that takes you to that website. And if you Google Vermont Vegetable and Berry Newsletter, you'll find mine too, but I will put them in the chat later. That's right, vvbga.org. Yeah, so we work with growers of all kinds, large, small, conventional, organic, beginning, experienced. There's definitely a strong organic production culture in Vermont. I always sort of estimate a third of the growers are certified, a third are functionally organic, third are we call conventional, but there's so much cross-pollination and commitment to soil stewardship and ecologically thoughtful practices that Vermont's a little bit unique in that way, where I feel like we're less carved up into those philosophical lanes than a lot of other places. But a lot of what we do is try and capture grower experience and best practices and sort of vet it and organize it and put it back out there. So the newsletter is growers reporting in. The listserv is people ask a question, they collect all the answers and send out a single email with, yeah, what are you using to hold your tomatoes up when you trellis them in the greenhouse? And then you get back 15, 20 responses, which can be hundreds of years of growing experience. And then we hold on-farm workshops, annual meetings, just like you all do, featuring both experienced speakers and new farmers too, trying to make everybody feel welcome. So what I'll talk about today is in that vein, where we engaged a whole bunch of farmers and citizen science to collect their own data, report things in, and we aggregated and shared it back out. So I'll take you through some of what we found. Is that coming through for you, Talia?
Yeah, looks great.
Okay, good. So the reason I call this tweaking is just it can start with small changes. I don't think a wholesale rebuild of tunnels is realistic for most growers, and I will show some cost benefit thinking around how much to change, but that's been on my mind as we have this range of technologies and strategies. Some of them are more expensive than others. How do you frame this so people can make a good decision for their own farm? Because everybody's in a unique situation, not just with their growing conditions, but their markets, their labor, their management capacity. Let's see if we can get this to advance. So this study we did was started by inviting I think it was 70 or 90, I can't remember, people that we knew were growing greenhouse tomatoes. They've been involved in some of our other on-farm research previously, so we had some evidence they'd be willing to engage. And this was the minimum expectations for participation, that you were growing tomatoes in this fashion in the ground. They were trellised. You had a double poly house using drip, been in production for at least 3 years, and we were focused on slicers or beefsteaks. So we were just trying to take some of the variability out of having people, in hydroponic or bag systems or growing cherries. It just would have made an already very variable data set way too messy to do some reasonable interpretation. And so we had these 48 participants, and you can see they're mostly in Vermont, but all the way over to Maine, basically every state in New England, and sprinkling of Eastern New York, which is kind of our constituency at this point. This, if you multiplied this by 10, that's what the Grower Association looks like. And you can actually get that map off of their website too. And these folks are all, the old term was kind of market garden. They are largely retail with some mix of wholesale usually, although there's a few straight up wholesale. And then they are growing a lot of other crops generally. So one of the first things we asked was, which cultivars are you growing? And as you can see, the popular ones just jumped out in this word graph. And I was surprised how dominant Geronimo was. But Rubelski, Big Dina, Cayman, they're all up there. And then you see there's some heirlooms in there, and maybe some things that don't really meet the definition of the slicer, but a lot of farms listed 3, 4, 5 varieties. So it's a mishmash. About half the growers were using grafted plants. And that is something that has just been growing in popularity, both as people get their skill set down for doing it. We have some farms, small farms that's become their business, supplying other farms with grafted plants. So it's becoming easier to get them, and the benefits are becoming clearer to people too. There is a much smaller choice of rootstocks, obviously, and Maxifort is by far the dominant one. But that's changing. This DRO variety is kind of new on the scene a few years ago. It's growing in popularity. The consistency of the size of the tunnels was a little surprising to me, just how dominant 30 by 96 foot house is. And then there's a smattering of smaller ones. And then we do have some people with 140, 200 foot long houses, but you can see on a farm that's in my town, actually, just the diversity of tunnel size and shape and manufacturers that's out there. So that's just another variability factor when it comes to comparing how the crops are doing. When we asked growers what their top 3 concerns were, diseases and fertility jumped right out. There were some that were a little surprising to me, like how high pruning labor rated. So that is something to think about as related to the systems people are using and how to be more efficient there. And then there's a lot of these that overlap, where a lot of growers just said diseases, but people also called out specifically botrytis. And then we have, you have fertility, but you have soil pH, salts. So there's some lumpers and splitters in the respondents. So we ask growers to self-report yield and also to say whether it was actually measured or estimated. And we did help people think with the forms to uh, count the number of boxes that they were harvesting or other methods. So the yield data is kind of sloppy, and yet it was pretty consistent. You can see how many farms are bumping around 2 pounds per square foot. And then it becomes sort of obvious when you look at the data and information from the farms that the people with the high yields are really focused on greenhouse tomato production, tunnel tomato production. For some of those farms, that's what they do, or there's very little uh, side crops, just the vast majority. So they're just really paying attention, and they've also made some of the investments to get the higher yields. And some of the people on the lower end, it's just not a big deal on their farm, so it doesn't get much attention. It's not a priority. But others, they could be doing better. They're not that different in their systems from some of the higher yielders. So my focus is sort of on this: how do you move people from 1.5 pounds to 2.5 pounds? Like that's where I think the management opportunities are, not necessarily to get everybody up to 4 or 5 pounds, because again, those are more investment intensive systems. The estimates of seconds or culls were all over the board. Some people really aren't tracking them. Some had really high non-marketable crops, mostly due to disease. But even if it was consistent around that, I mean, losing a fifth year crop, taking a fifth year crop out of your primary number ones that's a lot of economic hit. This also was really surprising to me, how consistent the retail price was. So it's really, between almost everyone was between $4 and $5 a pound. Which again, who knew till you ask. And so this is pretty reliable data, because it's not like yield where people aren't estimating, they know. And some of this has to do with, there are certain towns where you're just not going to get that money. So you're down around $3, or certain towns where you can get $7.50. But this is just helpful to understand when it gets to calculating what are these tunnels yielding economically. So if you take that average tunnel size times that average price, comes out to 26,000 US dollars and change. So just as a way to start to think about, when is it worth making an improvement? If you did something that was going to give you a 10% yield increase, that's $2,600. So how long would it take to pay that back? Again, there's no algorithm for this or set specific numbers. It's going to be a bit of intuition, but again, just trying to create a framework for, is it worth putting in a ridge vent or not? How much would yield have to go up to pay that back over what period of time? And so when we did the analysis of all of the variables I'm going to talk about that growers reported on and yield, there was no single variable that had a strong correlation with yield. It really comes down to putting together different tools in the toolbox. And this is what I'm going to show you, is sort of the difference between the high yielders and the low yielders. What are the sets of practices that people are using that seem to be related to yield? And if you think about it, it does make sense intuitively. It's just, people are paying attention to these things at some level: fertility, ventilation, circulation, variety. It's not like, oh, here's this one thing half the people have completely overlooked. If you just fixed it, boom, they get the yield. It's more, I would say, there's an opportunity for better management in a small number of things that could really move the needle. So after trying that failed attempt of correlation of 1 or 2 variables with yield, we just split out what are the top 10 yielders doing compared to all the others. And you can see they're getting twice as much yield, essentially 3.5 pounds versus 1.8. And they have the low yielders are trying to cover 44% more area per drip line than the top yielders. So we already knew this from some previous work. There's a lot of tunnels that they don't have enough drip lines, especially if your soil's at all light texture, but it's dry in between the lines and the roots aren't there. And so the nutrients aren't taken up, all those things. So that's a really simple thing to rectify is, and we have a lot of growers that have gone from 1 or 2 lines to 4 lines per bed. Just make sure they're wetting the entire rooting area. Not a big difference in the density per liter. So again, with the grafting, because a lot of people go to 2 stems, we're not talking about anything per plant. It's always about per liter, because some plants have 1, some have 2. We had one farm that goes to 4. But that's not a huge difference between these groups. I had the growers calculate the total ventilation openings in the tunnels, and then I was able to calculate the ratio of the openings to the square footage of the tunnel. Here's an area I thought would be more different, and it's not that different. They both have about the same amount of ventilation openings, and I also thought you'd have a longer growing period to get higher yield, but it's not that different. It's 169 days of transplant in the tunnel compared to 156. So again, that's not going to explain by itself, although 13 days of growth in a tunnel is definitely going to let you photosynthesize more and get more yield and harvest more. So here's where it starts to get really interesting of the practices where there seems to be a greater separation between the high yielders and the low yielders. The top difference was whether side ventilation was automated. And the more we've dug into this, the more it starts to make sense, right? You count that ventilation space, but if it's not open, it doesn't really count. And when is it open? Whenever you get there to open it. And then sometimes it shouldn't be open, but it is, because people go out, you open it up in the morning, you close it at night. So the sun comes out, the sun goes in. These automated sides obviously are going up and down to maintain whatever you put on the controller for temperature. So this is a pretty low cost investment compared to a lot of things, and something, the more we talk about it, the more people are latching on to. Makes sense. The other thing is just simply the labor savings. Even if there was no yield impact, if you count the time of going out, and some people still have the old bars, which are dangerous, but even with the cranks, you got to go out there and do that twice a day. The payback, that'd be interesting to calculate it just on labor. Grafted plants, pretty big difference there, which also makes sense. They just have a lot more vigor. Air heat, there's a difference, and this is also sort of back to the days in the tunnel and also when you plant, because the air heat for late planting and short season isn't going to do much for you. So it's really about going in. If you go in early enough, you need that. The long-term tunnel soil tests, I don't know how much you all are familiar with this, but we have developed over the years this 2-pronged approach where you have a regular soil test, which uses a weak acid to pull off the nutrients and kind of predict what's available to the plant over the entire growing season, with the saturated media test, which is a water extract. That's the potting soil test, essentially what's available now. So you get both immediate and reserve nutrients. And that's important because you put that transplant in a warm, moist, sunny tunnel, like it starts growing immediately. So it's not about the reserves. It's like, is there any nitrate nitrogen there today? Is there soluble potassium? So you want to know that for the short term, and you definitely need the long-term prediction for how you're going to fertilize over the whole season. The other thing is those saturated media tests give you soluble salts, which the field tests don't, because we don't care outside. It's not an issue. The rain and snow wash it away, but in the tunnels, it can build up. And you do get those measures of available N, both as nitrate and ammonium, which you don't get out in the field because it's just changing all the time. So those 2 things together are really useful. University of Maine runs that test for $30. Whereas our regular soil test, 17, and you're only getting part of the picture. The other thing is we've worked with UMaine to calibrate the results to recommendations. So the reason this all started is when people tested their tunnels, most of the nutrients were listed as off the charts, no fertilizer called for it. Yet we knew you have to fertilize because, again, you're getting 5 to 10 times the tomato yield that you get out in the field. So that's something we're still dialing in, and it comes down to you need an estimate of your yield expectation. Because if you're getting 1 pound or you're going to get 4 pounds, obviously it's 4 times the nutrients required. And so this is still an issue. A lot of growers don't have an idea of what their yields are or what to expect. And once we put those tables out there where you have low, medium, good, or excellent, most growers are overestimating what they're going to get, because that excellent yield is, I can't remember, 5 pounds and up. Good is 3 to 4. And you just saw most people are at 2. So you're going to get a recommendation that calls for over application if you think you're getting more yield than you're getting. So, and the other thing is the surface mulch, which were all over the board, everything white, black, straw, landscape fabric, bare. This is like the most inconsistent practice of any of them, of how variable it is of what growers are doing. But having anything compared to bare, whoops, you can see the top 10 are they all have some kind of surface mulch, and only 70% of the low yielders do. And finally, circulating fans, horizontal airflow, was another big factor. The top 10, 80% are using them, only half below. And this is another thing that emerged from this study, just the importance of, it's not just mixing temperature and humidity, it's mixing CO2. And I found a study that showed it was actually equivalent to CO2 addition in some cases, simply because when the wind isn't blowing and this air is static and it's sunny right around the leaves, you have a CO2 deficit unless you mix things up. And that gets more, granular. We have a lot of people with fans, but they're not sufficient. They're not the right kind. They're not moving enough air. They're cheap box fans or something. So there's calculations for exactly what kind of, cubic meters of airflow you need. So this is just a graph of the drip line differences. And you can see on the right, those tunnels are trying to irrigate a very wide swath. This is a little tricky to calculate because people don't have all the lines evenly spaced across the house, right? They're clustered in the beds. So I just took the average, the number of lines divided by the width of the house. But you can see that 2 feet is a lot of width to try and get water to move laterally. And this is why I tell people, just go out there and stick your hand in the soil in between the lines. And in a lot of tunnels you see, it's dry and there are no roots. And that's not desirable. And certainly in a setup like this is a house that's in ginger right now, but is also used for tomato production. And you can just visually see the water is not very far from the drip line. It is fanning out as you go down deeper, but especially on these light textured soils, you can see from the graph, it takes the smaller soil particles to help the water move through capillary movement sideways. And the sandier your soil, the more important it is that those lines be bunched up together. And so now this is what a lot of growers have gone to. Like I mentioned, four lines per bed in this kind of width. So you just have to use your judgment of how many are necessary, but roughly speaking, 8 to 12 inches between is, there's no problem if they overlap, right? It's still the total amount of water. It's when the two streams of water from the drip line don't overlap that you have issues. And this is 20 lines in a 30-foot tunnel. So that's the average again. That can see they're closer in the beds. So again, it gets tricky because people have different walkway widths in between these beds from, a foot to 3 feet. So it's hard to calculate. So how much ventilation should one have? My personal experience and my colleagues go into these tunnels and they're hot, they're humid, especially when the canopies are large later in the season and non-windy locations. They're big plastic bags with a few holes in them essentially, right? So especially when the holes are not up high and the warm, dirty air can't get out, they feel like they need more ventilation. And there is this calculation from the Society of Engineers that yeah, the ratio should be about 35%, which it's a lot of growers were almost there, and some are over, but certainly all the way to the left there, those houses are underventilated, and I think saying half of them are is a pretty good guesstimate. So what can you do? I'd say the practice in the middle has been the most popular and could be expanded upon, which is just make a hole up high on the end walls, like let that hot, humid air out. Just the physics of heat rising will work for you. That's a pretty small opening right there. We have growers who've cut everything above the door from wall to wall and have a giant hinged flap that usually goes in so the wind won't catch it. And it's on pulleys and ropes with cleats. And they just open that whole thing up and let the air out. And we have these small ones, which are better than nothing, but love to see that at least 2 or 3 times the size there so it can really let the air out. Growers that had purchased these older tunnels that tended to be these much lower and were difficult to work in the side rows anyway. We'll sometimes put in these extended ground posts to just get a lot of height on the roll up side. So you can see here they've added probably 6 feet to what they had. Obviously the ground post needs to be really solid to maintain the structural integrity of the house, and you may need to add some cross bracing as well, just to be sure you're not allowing it to wiggle. And then the ridge vent is kind of the Cadillac in terms of physics, just opening all the way across the top that lets all the dirty air out. Growers tend to love or hate these things. It's no fun getting up there and changing the plastic because you're going to end up putting on 2 sheets instead of 1, and you've got to be up on the ridge making that happen. Some growers leave boards on the cross braces to get up there, which blocks some light. It's probably not super helpful. It's not a lot of light loss, but so there's that. And then the wind catching them, they need to be oriented the right way so that, yeah, the wind isn't going to tear them off. And they're not inexpensive. I would say the 4,000 is an underestimate. I just saw some quotes that were getting close to twice that on a 100-foot house by the time you, including the plastic, because you have to replace the plastic with 2 pieces from 1. But they're pretty amazing. If you've been in them, the temperature is just always reasonable because there's no way the hot air can really accumulate. I talked about these labor-intensive systems for the roll-up sides, and certainly everybody should be moving away from the one at the left. Just, yeah, dangerous. Crank systems are popular, but these automatic venting systems, there's a pretty wide range of pricing, and you need a controller to drive them. But yeah, they're pretty reliable and getting to be increasingly popular. Advanced Alternatives is one brand people are using that seems to be popular. So keep in mind there's ventilation and there's circulation, and they're not the same. Having good circulation can help with ventilation because the air is moving, might be more likely to find its way out of an exit that the physics of heat rising is driving. But largely this mixing is to keep the temperature, humidity, and CO2 gradients uniform in the house. And I already talked about the CO2 kind of micro gradient. It may not even be top to bottom. It's just actually around the leaf. You're trying to mix that up, but certainly the temperature and humidity gradients are probably more at the macro level. And when this is working right, I mean, what I look for is just to sort of see is the majority of the leaves just trembling slightly. And that gets harder to achieve as the canopy gets larger. But the placement of these fans is really important. There's plenty of data out there of where to put them. You're basically trying to have a big swirling circle of air, and air is heavy to move. So one fan is pushing, and then the other fan at the other end catches the air as it bounces off that back wall. So that one is actually closer to the wall than one in the middle. If you have, depends how long your house is, but most of our 100-foot houses are having, 2 fans. And you got a slide there. Yep. And there's calculations. So Chris Callahan, who's an amazing ag engineer on our team, has a great blog site with all kinds of stuff on tunnels and post-harvest storage, but has done a nice post on circulation and ventilation. And you can determine how many cubic feet per minute your fan is moving, and the combination of them should total 8,500 in a tunnel that size, a 15-foot peak. And these high quality, slightly more expensive fans also use less electricity in the end. So it's worth making that investment. Yeah, so there's just always this dance you're doing of, from a disease management perspective, foliar disease, you'd love to have really widely spaced plants at a very low density so the leaves can all dry off and air circulates well, even when the canopy is full. From a yield perspective, you'd like to tighten it up. So there's no right answer. Some of it is which cultivars are you growing? What's been your history with diseases? Yeah, do you have something where you can spray and get management from a fungicide or bactericide or not? So you kind of got to piece it all together. So we've had growers go both ways, especially people growing more heirlooms and things that get a lot of leaf mold, backing off the density, giving more space, helping them dry out more. And then others with more standard greenhouse tomato varieties that realize, oh, I really should get down to closer to 4 square foot per liter, and have seen their yields go up. And especially the early yields, if you're really after that, the higher density makes sense. So there's no right answer to this, but I would say the people down at 2 square feet per plant are asking for trouble disease-wise, and the people up, 8, 9, 10, there's something else going on. Usually in that house, there's customers in there, or they've set up beds for a different crop. It's not really suited for tomatoes, but you can see most people are in that 4 to 6 feet. So that is what I would say is the guidance, depending on all those disease considerations and other factors where you want to be. But to say it should be exactly 4 or 6 is not something that makes sense to say. Temperature of the soil is often overlooked, even though it's so easy to measure. Just get a couple of these compost thermometers, and obviously you want them to be placed to the depth where the roots are. And we've seen this a lot where people are heating their tunnels, but the soils are cold because heat rises. And if you plant early, the only way to overcome that is to put in a root heating system or ground heat, and some simple systems for that. But this is the range of temperature you want to be in for the optimal plant growth is 70 to 75. I'm not trying to cook them by going higher than that. And they're kind of going to sit there if it's below 60. So that's a whole nother consideration of when do you want to start these tunnels. And most of our growers are starting when the soils are still cold. So they're 2/3 of them have set plants before early May. And certainly those people putting them out in March, all at bottom heat, because it wouldn't make any sense at all. And you could see they would just literally sit there, do nothing. But I would say that, that late April to first week of May, you're on the edge of whether a root zone system makes sense, because it's such a short period of time before the soils will start warming. And also some people are using plastics to help warm the soil. And just keep in mind, black plastic not laid tight to the soil does not heat the soil. It transmits heat physically from the hot plastic to the soil by contact. A loose plastic mulch will actually keep the soil cooler. So if you're going to use black to try and heat it, it's got to be on a smooth surface, laid really tight. Clear plastic obviously is a greenhouse effect and doesn't need to be tight. It'll heat it that way. So if you're not sure, just stick your hand under the plastic and see what the temperature is. And certainly any organic materials, straw, etc., will keep the soil cooler. So you wouldn't want to put that on until it's already thoroughly warmed. So is ground heat worth it? Very few of our growers in this survey were using it. I was actually surprised because it's not that complicated of a system to put in, and you saw so many of them are going into the ground uh, pretty early in the season. And the data has been out there. This is a study from 1982 that going from 57 to 71 degrees Fahrenheit, you got to increase your yield by a third to a half in Quebec, where they were setting them end of April, early May. So again, there's a thing where you can do a payback calculation. How much is that yield for you, and what's the cost of the system? There are some super fancy systems on the right, bigger houses with all these different zones and usually outdoor boilers and stuff. But most of our smaller growers just have domestic hot water heaters from whatever you're using, electric, propane, oil. And the designs have been out there for 40 years of how to design the loop so the water doesn't get too cold too fast, and the heat is distributed evenly, and how deep to place them and all that kind of stuff. I'd say the $1 is dreaming at this point. It's probably $2 or $3 a square foot realistically. And keeping the heat in the ground, the heat you already have, makes a lot of sense. So more and more growers have been using perimeter insulation, pink board, blue board, something down as deep as makes sense to go. 1 foot anyway, 18 inches, 2 feet. You don't want to destabilize your ground posts anyway. So that's a consideration. If you're not down 3-4 feet into the ground, you probably shouldn't be loosening up soil around those posts. We do have growers sometimes that have gone out at an angle to try and mitigate that loosening. But yeah, I did a study where we measured yield in all the different, were 6 beds in a 30, I can't remember exactly the width of the tunnel, but the outer 2 beds, the yields were a third less than the inner 4. And so there's a bunch of factors going into that. Some of them is this grower was, backing in a manure spreader and spreading the compost. So I'm sure there was a higher density of nutrients in the middle. Just the TLC, that it's harder to work on the outside rows, so they don't get the attention in the middle. But a big factor is also temperature. And we see this every year when there's early chilling injury or frost injury to tomatoes and tunnels. It's always the outside, obviously, where you see it first, just colder, and also you see the plants are shorter. So this is something to consider, pretty low cost if you don't have it. And then we get into the environmental controllers. There's some pretty simple systems that will just open and close your vents and turn on the heating. You can put irrigation on them. We went up to Quebec and saw some really advanced systems. It's controlling the CO2 injection, all of the different, the ridge vents, the side vents, the irrigation. See all the data on your computer. Again, higher investment facilities. So there's no right answer for your farm, but I think these are increasingly worth considering, and especially when you can't always be at the farm or at the tunnel all the time, and something needs to open and close or come on, it's going to happen. CO2 is not something most of our growers are adding to their tunnels. We have a few, and you can get these CO2 generators on propane for a couple $1,000. Certainly the benefit is more profound when the houses are closed and CO2 you add stays in there and isn't lost with ventilation. But up in Quebec, they were blowing it in pretty much all the time. So it's hard to know what the benefit is. Those houses where they were doing it were these more triple bay gutter connected. So there's a big volume of air and plants in the middle that is not as highly ventilated as some of these narrower, longer tunnels. And of course the cost of the CO2, but obviously with the yield increasing, when you double the CO2 to 1,000 ppm, or the growth doubling, it's something to think about. But the first step is just to have a good mixing with the horizontal airflow fans to be able to utilize all the CO2 that you already have. And this was the study that got me thinking harder about that. It was with tomato seedlings. So you have to take it with a grain of salt, but you can see um, those two bars in the middle, which are similar yields, were either high CO2 without much circulation or low CO2 with a lot of circulation. So um, that just tells you how important circulation is. And without either of them, yield drops way up. And having both of them, you get a bump, but it's not as big of a difference as not having one or the other. And wrapping up here, talking about IPM, I see you've got a webinar coming up on that. I was kind of surprised that a third of the growers don't use biocontrols. Our entomology lab has been a leader in promoting the use of banker plants, the use of what they call habitat plants too, which Alyssum is a popular one where you're providing nectar and pollen and a place to hang out, and also places for the prey for the predators. And so just having a few of these plants in the end rows, they're also using, beans to monitor for thrips and marigolds. And so there's a lot of simple information you can get from having a small number of these plants in your tunnels. So I definitely would recommend looking into that. The UVM entomology lab does have some good info online. We have, and you can see Ophidius is the most popular. We obviously have a lot of aphid problems like anywhere. Ophidius, Phytalides, people are buying, lady beetles and putting them out there for hotspots. And Encarsia is common for whiteflies. So I don't know what your suppliers are like up there, but we've got a few good ones down here. IPM Labs in New York State is where a lot of people go for their advice and beneficials. And we have three kinds of growers. One that just don't do this at all, a third of them. Another third, they respond to the presence of the pests, and sometimes it's too late. It's an epidemic already, and biocontrols aren't going to do anything for you. But the ones that have some kind of scouting and monitoring, they catch something, then they order it. And other people that are just on regular prophylactic shipments, here's my schedule for getting the beneficials in, just send them to me. I don't want to mess up my scouting or monitoring, and the investment is worth it. So I think either of the second two are good. I wouldn't recommend not using them at all. And a bit of an aside, we have hardly any growers that have these harvest tools, gantries or harvest carts suspended, and a few that do like them a lot. And I was talking to Rimal, one of our greenhouse suppliers, saying they used to be more popular, and for some reason fallen out of fashion. I don't know if it's the people wanting high density plantings. So there's some systems you can purchase, but this one was put together by the grower for $2,500. And as he says, you'd never go without them at this point. It's just too much of a labor saver and ergonomically very helpful too. So I mentioned this long-term high tunnel soil test, and I think another piece of that is a lot of our organic growers are front loading with something that will release slowly. Seed meal, soybean, peanut, feather meal, some kind of mixture, blood meal, who knows, all kinds of things. Mostly it's potassium sulfate fines, and the fines are really important. The small particles, the big particles tend not to dissolve in the tunnel. And the UMaine lab was reporting, seeing the particles in their soil test samples coming, like it's not the same as outside. So, but once you have the fines and Chilean nitrate, which I don't know if you're allowed to use organically up there, but that's what people are fertigating with, and typically using tissue tests, leaf analysis, to identify the need for P and K during the season. And then we have way too many tunnels that the pad wasn't raised enough, the drainage ditches weren't built, the water is infiltrating and keeping the soil cold and saturated. So that's an upfront issue to be addressed. It's hard to fix after the fact, although some people have put in drainage tile. And then if you're going to spray, you should do it right. Like there's no point in throwing something on once in a while here or there. You have a problem. The tissue is always growing. Every time it grows, it's exposed. Need to reapply. whatever it is you're using for disease control. And then that are doing that have really found that these, yeah, battery, an electric sprayer with the hand pump thing is just gets old really fast. And a battery powered sprayer that lets you spray as often as you need to get good coverage makes a lot of sense. And Dram is one that people really like. I just think they're around $400. So and then you start to try and put a pencil to all this. Okay, that long-term high tunnel test is $30. How many pounds of tomatoes more do you need to get to pay that back? Not very many. And I always tell people it's not a religion, it's just data. Like you look at it and when you're kind of in the middle, it's not that helpful maybe, but wow, and hey, there's no potassium in my soil hardly. It tells you something. Adding drip lines is low cost. Those gable vents on the ends, pretty low cost. So if you did all of these, if you haven't done any of them yet, it's $5,000 or $6,000. So you can start to think about what the payback is on that in terms of how much more yield you have to get, which should be 2 years if you bumped your yield up by 10%. And then if you add some more expensive things, going to grafted plants, putting in the root zone heat, automatic roll-ups, you're twice that much, and it's going to take twice as long to pay it back. Yeah. So that's the story. I can pop some links in the chat for you, and time for questions.
Yeah, we do. That was awesome. Thanks so much. I enjoyed it
You're
just
welcome.
as much the second time as I did the first. So there you go. So yeah, I don't have any questions pop in the chat, but I had a few for you. Can you hear me okay?
I can.
Awesome. So one thing that we didn't really talk about was like preventative spray programs, or we kind of talked about the insect side and beneficials, but what are you kind of seeing from the disease side?
Yeah, I mean, our growers are largely spray avoidant.
Yeah.
And um and then there's some things you can live with and some things you can manage environmentally. So certainly, things like botrytis is good pruning, not leaving stubs that are going to be a source of the spores. And sometimes people see the little ghost spot, the little white circle on the fruit. So you got to get your humidity down. You've got to do sanitation to get any dead tissue out. So people, if you do that, you shouldn't have to spray for it. And again, it comes down to good ventilation and humidity control. Powdery mildew has been one of our bigger problems, and we had a disastrous time 5 or 6 years ago where it came in on transplants from a lot of them from sources that I shall not name, but people bought in grafted plants that started the problem early, and then it was hard to get ahead of. So a couple of things there. I mean, one is Rebelsky has a lot of tolerance. So that's one reason you saw it's quite popular. And then potassium bicarbonate, we'll probably have different names in Canada, but Calagreen and it's escaping me now. But yeah, potassium bicarbonate is basically sort of like baking soda. So at the very first sign of that disease, people trying to keep the tissues covered. So that's works. Then, the leaf mold, fulvia, there are no sprays that are effective organically, especially, but I think in general. So it comes down to humidity management and cultivar selection.
So just a quick add-on to that before we jump to the question in the chat. Do you see people sort of using heating to try to stave off or deal with excess humidity sort of early in the mornings?
Yes, so that's important, right? To remember, warm air holds more moisture than cold air. So, and then when you're growing in ground, you just have this huge reservoir of moisture that's going to move into the air. So it's counterintuitive, but yes, people heat up that air in the morning and vent it out and
Mhm.
try and start the day with dry air. It's also important because the stomates close under high humidity and you just don't have transpiration, which the sun
Right.
comes out, the plants want to photosynthesize, they can't do it. So there's a lot of good reasons to heat and vent early in the morning to get the humidity down.
Awesome. Okay, so do you have any best practices or resources for cleaning the interior side of greenhouse plastic?
That is a good question. Short answer is no, not off the top of my head. Have to look into. Obviously, you have to be careful with any kind of power washer. You're gonna damage your plastic, and you also want to be careful with any strong material, detergent, or it partly depends what you're trying to get off. Is it just lightly adhered soil particles, or is it algae and things like that? But you know, gentle scrubbing with a gentle detergent would be my first reaction, but I'd have to look into it more. I will say in general, greenhouse sanitation, we had a great talk from Kevin O'Dwyer at Langwater Farm in Eastern Mass. He's a great organic grower. He is so gung-ho on oxidate. They sterilize all their stakes, basically every surface, every non-damageable surface. So the tabletops, the stakes, the rollers for 20, yeah, everything's getting sanitized as a preventative measure, which makes a lot of sense when you think it through. It's may or may not be the problem that year, but anything you can do to prevent something from getting going helps. Plastic age and
And
light penetration.
was
So
that
that's
presentation?
he gave a talk at the New England meeting, so that could be online. He grows outdoor tomatoes, but his greenhouse is where he starts the seedlings, so that's where he was talking about that. But I think that sanitation approach is farm wide, indoors and out. The question about the age of plastic, we didn't ask because the rule of thumb is 4 years, and even though in theory plastic can last somewhat longer, it's getting nicks and scratches and dirt and soil. So especially if you're growing it all in the shoulder seasons, you're going to be losing photosynthetic light, and you can't see that with the naked eye. I do have a little meter. I go into tunnels, and you can really tell, especially on a cloudy day, the plastics that's more than 4 years old and that isn't, and people that keep it for 6 or more, you're just losing yield potential. And again, the more you need the light, the more that threat is real. In the dead of summer, the plants are already saturated, so it wouldn't make a difference, but everybody's starting at some point in the spring and some go through the fall. So I don't think it's a good place for saving money, is trying to make your plastic go longer than it was intended for.
Interesting. All right, do we have any last minute questions? I'm curious about the rootstocks that you mentioned. Were those selected because of higher tolerance to root disease, or just generally it's a strong rootstock? Um,
I think it's mostly related to the amount of vigor, that
okay.
some are too vigorous, some are not as vigorous, and also it's a tricky thing. Part of it's familiarity. Growers know when to start the rootstock, when to start the scions, because you're trying to line up the size of the stems so that you can graft them and they don't grow at the same rate necessarily. So there's kind of that factor in there too, is it's working. So they haven't switched. I know there's one rootstock that was kind of disastrous a few years ago, but it's off the market. I can't recall the name. So it's
Well,
just,
that's good.
yeah, it's proven.
Can't buy by accident.
Yep. So as far as if you want to get on the newsletter list, just shoot me an email. It's Vernon, Vernon .Grubinger @uvm.edu. That's just me manually adding you to a list. If you want to join the Vegetable Growers Association, that's where you go to their website.
Sorry, that was at edm.edu.
at UVM,
UVM. Yep.
University of Vermont, Verdes Montañas, .edu, uvm.edu.
Okay, I just popped that
There
in
you
the
go.
chat there. It
Thank
looks
you.
okay. Perfect. Okay, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate that. Yeah, if anyone has any questions about what they saw today, you can either reach out to myself or reach out to Vern directly. So I hope you guys
Absolutely.
all have a good day. And yeah, we'll stay up to date on those updates. That's awesome.
Okay, thanks. Take care.
All right, have a good one. Bye.